Growth Pod is brought to you by Genero, a leading growth agency in the Nordics. We interview marketing experts, business leaders, and entrepreneurs to uncover the stories and strategies behind profitable growth.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
I was very excited as I was preparing to this, because there's a lot of questions that I want to ask you, but around startups and investing and all that. But I'd love if we could a little bit go back first to your beginnings. You founded a company, I think it was in 2007, called Jaiku, which you in less than 2 years you sold to Google. And I think at least then in 2009, Google was like the most innovative, most sophisticated tech company. And so could you go through a little bit of like what was the idea that led to Jaiku, and what was that whole process of like building the app very quickly and then exiting to Google in such a short time?
Sure. Obviously, world looked different then, but maybe not that different. I worked at Nokia on a phone, like an internet phone, that it grew evident wasn't going to be successful. And so I left to start the same, but as a software-only app, you would call it now, and teamed up with my friend and even current partner Petteri Koponen and Mika Raento, Teemu Kurppa, who is now CTO of Oura, and Juha Törönen, Andy Smith, a few other really talented people, Mikko Hyppönen, who actually is not the security Mikko Hyppönen, but a designer who designed the user experience. And so it was a small team. And I think what happened was it grew quite fast. It was right around the time that Facebook and Twitter, the two key competitors, also got founded. And we ran out of money because at the time it was not possible for a company that didn't seem to have a business model, because the business model was based on ads, which we all now know works. At the time, it wasn't apparent to European investors that this was possible. And so we had to sell the company because we couldn't raise enough capital to keep going as a funded business. At the time, there were venture capital firms in the US that funded our competitors, but at the time they weren't really investing in Europe yet. So,
got it. And I saw some graph on some blog post that detailed like the Twitter user count versus Jaiku's user count. I don't know if it was legit, but it seems like you were really, kind of going neck to neck with Twitter in terms of growth.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, people don't realize that at the time because it was still such small scale. Twitter was as well, right?
Yeah. These platforms probably only had some hundreds of thousands of users at most. And so, yes, it was the early days. And I think it just, it's testimony to the power of financing. Sometimes you need access to capital in addition to having a great idea and a good team. And that was the part that I think caused, Facebook ultimately to win over Twitter and Jaiku.
Yeah, I want to get back to those parts about financing and team. Just when it came to Jaiku, so Google bought you, and then I guess it was folded into what became Google Plus. Is that how it kind of worked?
Our team was brought in for a specific job, which was to build out a mobile-first competitor to Facebook. And we initially rejected Google's acquisition offer. We had acquisition offers from several other companies as well. Until Google showed us a prototype of Android, which had not been launched yet and wasn't, generally people didn't know Google was working on a phone that was going to compete with iPhone. Having worked at Nokia, I could see that it was a winner, and so it seemed reasonable at the time that this would actually outcompete Facebook, because Facebook was a website. It did not have a mobile angle at the time. We were all about mobile, and so we knew that mobile was going to be the winning user interface, and being able to build something that would become the de facto operating system and build it into that seemed like a reasonable bet. So we went for that. What ended up happening was Google couldn't launch Android this way because it got rejected by the mobile operators that still had a lot of power at the time. And so there was a big project inside of Google called de-Googlifying Android, which basically ripped out most of what we were building in addition to all of the other Google apps and turned Android into a more generic operating system.
Got it. I didn't realize that. What was it like? Just you kind of briefly, as I mentioned, like Google, at least at the time, was seen as this, like the pinnacle of success and most innovative and most sophisticated. What was it like then running a product? I think you ran a product team inside Google. Did you any like lessons that you picked up on, or was it kind of big bureaucracy like most big companies?
I found it super depressing because I was working on something that I, felt wasn't gonna win, especially after this, sort of pivoting of Android into what ultimately shipped. And so also, I think, at the time, Google had a pretty misinformed approach to social. And so I actually quit before the product that I led launched, before this, Google Plus, Google Buzz, whatever they called it. Even the name was, I think, very unfortunate. And so it was, I felt like, like I had, my balls had been cut off because I couldn't really do anything. And so I had to leave, and I started another company, and it was a little bit of a cognitive dissonance because I think from the outside it looked very exciting and like a great outcome. But then on the inside, it felt like, wow, things were, going badly wrong. And I wasn't really able to, at the time, do much about it. Google came back and proposed to acquire my second company, and it would have involved me going back in to lead Google Plus again. But I, at the time, chose to go another path because I didn't want to go back to that. I mean, it's just, I think it was also an unfortunate time to be at Google. Google was still being run by Eric Schmidt, and the founders were a little bit checked out. Later, Larry Page came back to be CEO, and obviously now Sundar, who was awesome. I remember Sundar well from my days at Google, and I think that also played into it, that it just happened to be at a time when Google was, maybe as a company, not at its most innovative.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like you said, from the outside, it looks like this fairy tale, like this best possible outcome. But like you said, in reality, can look quite different. So then you did the other startup, Ditto, which ended up selling to Groupon.
Yeah.
And after that, you had maybe some other projects, or when did you get involved in VC?
I started angel investing out of the money I made from selling Jaiku to Google. And I invested in companies like Aura, Amplifier, which is now Unity, and a bunch of other companies that some, unfortunately, which have done super well since then. And after doing two companies and selling them, I thought maybe I should, try this investing thing. And so I worked at True Ventures, who had originally led. We discussed. It was funny. It's just last week, Phil Black, founder of True Ventures, was here in Finland because we continued to collaborate and co-invest. I think True, when I joined True, pretty quickly became the most active Silicon Valley venture firm to invest in Finnish companies because I think I wrote maybe 5 or 6 checks into companies like iSci. There's a company now called Metacore, which is a gaming company. It was called something else at the time, and a bunch of other companies, including Musician, for example, that True backed. And so that collaboration still continues today. And I think what I realized after sort of practicing investing there for a bit and learning about being a fund manager was that this, actually I like playing midfield, and I I still start companies occasionally, and now I can back them myself. And so I think it's what I call like a dual threat, founder and investor. That role fits me well.
Okay, yeah, his name Trey Stevens, I think, at Founders Fund. It's one he co-founded Andrel, and also I guess that's at Founders Fund. That's fairly common that they're active as both partners and investors and founders.
I mean, I think at many of the funds you find folks like that. Andreessen Horowitz, Kozla, pretty much all of the strong early stage funds that people don't really recognize so well outside of the Valley. So it's a very common thing that they are being run by founder operator turned VCs. Yeah.
Got it. And I think in your podcast, you mentioned there was some study that they had done and showed that the most successful VCs are the ones with a entrepreneurial background.
That's right. I think that particular study had noted that it's specifically the entrepreneurs who are successful who become successful VCs. The founders who fail were actually less likely to succeed as venture capitalists than people who became venture capitalists who did not have a founder background. So I think what you want is a successful founder.
Yeah. And you mentioned, I think, the halo effect as a potential. That would explain both the successful being successful and the not so successful, no one really wanting to work with them, even though they might be very skilled investors or operators.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously lies in statistics. I'm sure there are many failed founders who have been successful as investors, and also it's important to recognize that for every success that a particular founder has had, they've probably had 10 failures. But yeah, I mean, I think it seems like a reasonable expectation that having someone who has already made money. I mean, that's the other thing people forget, especially in Europe, is VC really it's for people who already have money. Because you have to deploy capital. And it's, at least in the US, it's expensive to be a general partner at a VC. You must invest in your own funds. You typically are an active angel on the side. You invest, we're probably LPs in at least a dozen of our peers' funds. It's not for someone who, starts from scratch with an empty bank account.
Yeah. And obviously it's very illiquid as well, so that plays a role. Okay, so going back to when you started doing angel investing, and you mentioned Aura as one of the first examples, what was kind of your methodology when it came to scouting and finding the good investing? Like, did you have certain criteria they were looking for, or how did you, for instance, pick out Aura as a good investment?
I think these things are a function of your, access to just smart people. Everyone has their own way of getting there. I don't think there's one recipe of success in being an early stage investor. But I think some of the commonalities these people share are that they tend to be people that have the ability to win the respect of intelligent people. And importantly, also earn the appreciation of honest critics. So it's generally people who are smart and who aren't too smart, meaning that they have some sense of, I don't know if humility is the right word, but at least they don't take themselves too seriously. And so they tend to attract other smart people. And then you just pull on these networks. And that's how you end up coming across folks that have a great idea. And then sometimes you can catalyze them to take that idea into action and turn it into a company. I think which is the ideal scenario for an investor, because then typically you become involved right from the beginning. You become involved even before the thing really begins, because you're there to start it and give it a name, give it an idea, found the company, seed it with the first check, and so on. that's what I like doing. That's what I focus on.
And so if the idea is very critical there, how do you go about evaluating an idea, especially at the early stage? If you take something, looking at your portfolio now, you've got carbon removal, you've got AI, you've got supersonic travel, a lot of these very electric autonomous drones, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of these very novel new technologies. So how do you evaluate when you're sitting across from a founder if this person is crazy or just really ambitious and sees something that's really way ahead of the curve? Like, how do you evaluate if it's feasible, what they're talking about?
Yeah, I think a lot of that happens before you ever end up sitting across a person who's possibly a founder.
Okay.
You know, and I was just at lunch with someone, another investor, before we met up here at the studio, and we were talking about a mutual friend and colleague of ours, Petteri Koponen from Lifeline Ventures, who I've mentioned this on our own podcast. You know, I tend to call him the Leo Messi of European venture capital, because if you've ever gone to see or watched a game on TV where Leo Messi is playing soccer or football, there are times when you tend to just kind of, you know, stop looking at him because he seems so lazy. He's just kind of walking around, sauntering on the field, sort of looking distracted and lazy. And you're like, who is this guy? Like, he must be so full of himself because he's such a big star that he's not really even paying attention to the game. And so you turn to talk to your friend who's sitting next to you on the bleachers. I've had this happen. I've gotten to see a bunch of Leo's games, and you know, I reach down to take a drink, sip from my Coke or whatever, and then without realizing it, suddenly the crowd erupts in cheers because Messi just scored while you weren't looking. And I think Petteri has this ability too that, you know, many times he seems like he's really, it's not really clear what he's up to. But then suddenly he scores. And so this is because you have to have a prepared mind. Like, if you take up too much busy work, thinking I think a lot of, you know, founders and, you know, investors talk about hustle. You have to constantly hustle. You tend to become somehow distracted, and your buffers get full, so to speak. And you need the bandwidth to be able to act quickly and decisively when you recognize an opportunity. And so the best investors are like this. They are seers. They can see the thing and then instantly hit, you know. It's like boxing. Like, you know, you see an opening, and before the opponent knows what happens, you know, they barely blinked and they're down. And so it's this kind of ability, which in early stage, particularly in the Valley, separates the great from the merely good, because, you know, deals, when they come on the horizon, become very competitive very quickly. And here you don't really hear so much talk about like an Orange Eve or a Floodgate or a Founder Collective or Saka's first fund, Chris Saka's, you know, lowercase one. You know, it's a 100x fund. These are the best performing funds. They're not Andreessen Horowitz or even Sequoia. And it's because these investors have been able to get into deals super early. And they can then typically get the best multipliers. And their funds tend to be pretty small, and it's difficult to get in them. And sometimes, like in the case of, I don't know, Hunter Walk from Homebrew, they have actually stopped raising outside capital, and they only invest the partner's capital. So, you know, sometimes the only way to invest with them is to deploy your own capital alongside them and be friends with them. You know, Reid Hoffman, who just invested in Steady Energy, our Finnish nuclear reactor company here, same way. I mean, Reid did it as a personal ticket out of his foundation. He didn't do it out of the Greylock fund. So you have to, that's the other thing is, you know, you have to be able to collaborate with the best, because investing is still a collaborative game. And you need these people because they will then lend their incredibly effective networks into the service of the company and help it raise additional capital, acquire additional customers, hire the best talent.
Is that a lot of questions that I could ask there? Just, it was interesting. I think you mentioned that for VCs, there's this tension between, on one hand, wanting to grow asset under management because that gives you bigger carry, more management fee. On one hand, wanting to keep the fund small because that gives you a better multiplier. So, which way are you kind of leaning with ESVC? Like,
our funds are small. Again, yeah, it's a question of whether you're building an institution that has a lot of AUM, a lot of fee. You can hire a lot of people. You can see firms go this way. Andreessen, I think, just raised an additional, $7.5 billion. These big funds, that's fine. That's one way of surviving. What you need to do then is not only get in the winners, but then deploy a lot into the winners. And then, but it's different from the practice of kind of company creation and being there at the very beginning.
Yeah, for sure.
So, yeah, it's also just kind of, to each their own,
Yeah. And like you mentioned, those are the things that you're kind of interested in. You've kind of stressed a few times the importance of network. And I think you've mentioned it in one of your podcasts that kind of like what ESVC really, the biggest value add to founders is this access to really high quality follow-on, add-on investors. But, is that kind of like the bottleneck when we think about Finnish, Nordic companies, startups, is that they're outside of like this, obviously, maybe out of London, but this, especially the US and Silicon Valley. And a lot of them don't have access to those networks and to that amount of capital, which in the US is like 3 times as big as Europe combined. Is that like a problem? And is that something that you're, obviously, you were doing that with True Ventures. You were helping bridge the gap between Silicon Valley and Finnish startups.
Yeah, look, since True started investing in Finland, a lot of other funds have done that too. I think, Benchmark has 1 or 2 investments here. I'm not sure about Sequoia, certainly. Well, actually, Linear, but it's a U.S. company, I guess, is a Sequoia deal. Excel, obviously, London funds like Index, very active here. So, it's great for them when they find a winner. So, but yeah, that's historically been my role. Is I'm a bridge, right? I'm a bridge between Valley Capital and the top Finnish founders, and it's a good niche. I can fulfill that. I hope that there are more of us in the future. Is it a necessary role? Not always. The top founders are fine. They don't necessarily need me, but it can certainly make everything happen more quickly. And then there are times when investors really matter. For example, ISI, a satellite company here that's required a lot of financing, probably would have died without True Ventures because True had large enough funds to, for example, not just lead the Series Seed, which I led while I was at True, but also lead the Series B, which was already a large round especially on Finnish terms, that I don't think any of the Finnish VCs at the time could have led. Yeah. And without that, ISI probably couldn't have raised that round. And so there are times when it can become existential to have the right investor, like ISI did in that case, and probably some Finnish companies that would have otherwise had success have failed because they maybe haven't been able to access that. So yeah, I think what we want here is a thriving ecosystem that also has, larger local homegrown funds. Right now, all of the Finnish venture funds are roughly the same size. They're all around 100 million. They all invest at seed. And if my partner Timo Ahopelto calculated that the unicorn birthing rate, the unicorn birth rate has thankfully gone up from 0.8 10 years ago to something around 2.3, I think he had said, right now per year, then you still have, 30 Finnish managers who are all competing for those two deals a year, which means that only the very top one or two will have, outsized returns. So I would rather, join or invest in those managers and then focus on increasing that unicorn birth rate. And maybe also back the companies that show the strongest growth, the Auras or the iSize or the Swappies or, whatever they are, at a later stage, rather than allow that hard work that has gone into kind of creating them and building them from scratch to then sort of generate the opportunity for outside investors to really reap the large rewards. Like you were saying, the big assets under management, AUM guys who have funds in the billions, who can deploy 100 million, 250 million, 500 million into a growth company like Volt or Supercell or Aura. And then once that 3Xs or 5Xs, they will make over $1 billion on that. Typically, what's happened is the Finnish capital pools haven't participated in those rounds anymore. And it also has the other unfortunate effect that it tends to shift the balance of power in those companies abroad. Yeah. And so we end up with management that sits in San Francisco, like with Aura, or the companies getting sold to acquirers like DoorDash.
Yeah, I think you mentioned somewhere that less than 1% when it comes to major Finnish pension funds, less than 1% of their total funds are committed to VC, which I guess is then lower than some other countries. So do you think that's a big bottleneck right now, is that we technically, we have the money in Finland, but we're not deploying it on startups specifically?
Yeah, look, like Finland's a poor country on pretty much any terms you want to measure with. The thing about it is that the largest pools of capital here really are the pension funds. Yeah. We don't have as much private capital, private wealth, family wealth as Sweden, for example. And so in addition to the government, then we need to look at what the pension funds are doing. And thankfully, they have written small tickets into, really token tickets into some of the VCs, even some directs. But what they really should be doing, in my perspective, is, taking advantage of the great work that the founders and the VCs in Finland have been doing and benefiting, ultimately the Finns whose pensions will be hopefully, dealt out from their funds also in the future by investing in the top performers. And they really aren't doing that right now. And we hope to change that. So I think that's one of the most obvious low-hanging fruit opportunities for these pools of capital that hopefully they will begin taking advantage of now that we've done the hard work over the last 10 years of creating a pretty steady flow of these high-performing companies here.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that. I had a meeting with one person at one of these pension funds, and he mentioned that they can come into a fund. This was in the PE context. That's not the issue. The issue is that they have limits on how much they can participate, and it's finding the rest, because we don't, like you said, we don't have private wealth. We don't really have a lot of family offices, and so that's maybe a big constraint.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what that person was referring to. There are a number of these so-called constraints that make absolutely no sense, that are complete rubbish. Yes, it's obvious that if you're investing into a fund, a venture fund, typically as an LP, you don't want to own more than 10% of that fund, and there are such constraints which are fine, but these are typical of any manager probably doesn't really want an LP that's larger than that. So, right. Okay. The other thing is, like, what they should be doing is, and these companies, like if you invest through a fund or an SPV into a high growth company like an Aura or a Volt, you can easily deploy 100 million into it, and you will still own only a fraction of it if you're investing at let's say a $3 billion valuation. you're not a particularly significant owner in that. You're not going to, ideally what you want to do is you want to have the manager invest through a manager who's already on the board, one of the Finnish VCs, for example, such that who you already know and who knows the company well and who can govern for you. So it's an amazing deal for these, and it's fine. I mean, these companies can raise that, and they do raise that from outside investors, and that's typically what we do. And frankly, that's kind of been my specialty is also sourcing that capital, that follow-on capital from U.S. investors. And I have no quibbles with that. They're usually really good. Now that we're at this point where we're starting to have to figure out how the hell we keep the Finnish welfare state going, this is one of the ways that I think we can easily take a little bit of some of that upside and make sure that it also benefits our system here. So, yeah.
Suppose then we were able to unlock this pool of, like you said, we don't really have a lot of wealth, but we have some, and that could be put to use, deployed more effectively. The kind of question that I have, and when I look at, for instance, Sweden, and we got like Northvolt, I don't know if this is really a startup anymore, but anyway, they've raised like 13 billion debt and equity, H2 Green Steel over 6 billion debt and equity. And it seems to me that even if we had the exact same preconditions in Finland in terms of access to raw materials, infrastructure, government incentives, there's not a single person or group of people in Finland who could, through storytelling, through having a large enough vision, through having, I don't know if it's access to the network, I don't think that we have anyone who could put together that amount of money when we're talking about billions and billions and billions. Do you agree? Is that a bottleneck for us?
I think that's potentially true until someone actually goes and does it. I mean, nobody did in Sweden before that either until it got done. And so, yeah, I mean, in that sense, it's not that dissimilar. I mean, we're doing something like that with Steady Energy. There are things like P2X here. We just need to do more of it. And yeah, it's, the thing I think that is making it hard in Finland is that we just kind of have to decide that we're going to do this. And then it involves the pools of capital, meaning the pension funds. It involves the government, not just the TESI entities, but also, certain political decisions to be made. Everybody just kind of has to decide, okay, let's just do this. And Finland's a wonderful place when that happens, because then you tend to be able to get things done really quickly, like we're seeing in the case of, I don't know, nuclear energy now, or we're seeing in the case of some defense-related things, not as much as I would like to see, but, so it's not really that hard. It's really just a question of people deciding that it's a good idea.
So it's a matter of collective decision, kind of like what it feels like Israel, Sweden, Estonia, like those kinds of like small countries have.
Yeah, if you talk to almost anyone in power in Estonia or Israel, they're like, yep. Or even Sweden. It's like, yeah, like this is a good idea. We just need to understand what the really strategic things are. Like, for example, let's say batteries are, or nuclear power is, or in Israel, I don't know, for example, an RNA foundry and making sure we have a strong RNA industry. It's going to, those are heavy upfront capital costs. Or in the U.S. with the Investment Reduction Act now, these are political processes. They require a lot of debate, but then ultimately you end up with a decision. And so, yeah, I mean, we just want that process to be functioning here in Finland as well. And it's not, it requires people to actually have that debate and decide that it's something that they believe in. And we have something called the Finnish startup community here, for example, that's sort of purpose designed to introduce these, this kind of practice which has been lacking from Finland. And I think it's been doing a pretty good job. So I'm optimistic. I think that we're going in a good direction.
Okay, that's really good to know. And I guess every successful company, not just the supercells and Volts, but every successful startup kind of gives credibility to the fact that this is working and we have the ability to produce these decacorns or world-leading companies, startups in Finland as well.
Yeah, I think we have some on the way now. Certainly Aura, ISI, there are companies that have started growing rapidly. I don't know about something like an IQM, but I think that's another potential good example. What we want is we want more of them, and we want them in the fields where right now we're not active. We have something like Senso Fusion in defense, anti-drone systems. We want to see a company like that get 10 times, 50 times bigger than it is now. I think we want to design our own cruise missiles here, for example. We want to design our own David Sling, our own Iron Dome, what we're seeing functioning really well in Israel right now. Helsinki certainly needs one. You just look at the map and see how close we are to the Russian border, and you're like, well, we probably need one of those here. And they bring with them the talent that knows how to create them. And it's not okay for us to rely on purchasing this stuff from the United States or even Israel. They're expensive. And the other thing is that in any kind of conflict situation, they tend to get used up really fast. Just this weekend, for example, Iran, sent hundreds of drones and missiles towards Israel. Okay, nearly all of them got intercepted, but you just do the math. And if it costs 10 times more because you're purchasing expensive equipment, F-35, compatible gear from the United States defense industry, for instance, for each one, if you, burn a Patriot every time that you're shooting down a $10,000 rocket that's been shot at you from a cheap launcher, then at some point that math's going to stop working. So I think these are just sort of obvious, practical reasons why we should be investing in our own R&D and development of these kinds of interception systems, lasers, radars. We have an excellent, the world's basically a monopoly on radar satellite imagery because of ISI now, which is heavily being used by the United States military and Ukraine. So we have these assets already that we've been developing, and we need to recognize them and celebrate them and build more. So, but again, I see these things as an opportunity. That's kind of how I invest whenever I think about some feasible thing that could be a crisis that is either imminent or pending or just a possibility. I tend to flip it around and think, okay, well, if that happens, if she invades Taiwan, how is that going to change the world? What are we going to need? Should I be investing in something, or should I start building something now that, in case that happens, will be helpful? Or what if there's another pandemic? Or what if climate change accelerates more rapidly than we think, and we run into some issues with, for example, losing fresh water in certain areas, or here in Finland, what is it going to mean for our coastlines or our ability to grow our own food, our ability to manage the inevitable move north of a lot of people who get displaced. We can actually turn these into opportunities to build businesses, build startups, to build technology and solutions. And I think, that's the inspiring part about this job, is that you can actually approach it, instead of approaching it as a way to make money, as a way to make peace and, basically enable your kids to live in a better world. And, what's not to like about that? So we need that here. If we, as a collective, as a society, decide that, this is what Finland should be known for in the world, then I think, the world's our oyster. We can become another better Israel or another, better island state, we can kind of create our own version of what it's like to have, sort of like we're a superpower in whatever, rally drivers or hockey. We can be a superpower in startups that do good.
I think that's a really compelling kind of pitch, and I guess that's what you and other people are really working on. And I know that, I mean, looking at your portfolio, you're certainly putting your mouth where your money where your mouth is, compared to, I know sometimes you go on these VC websites and they have these lofty mission statements, and they look at the portfolio and it's like 5 different ad tech companies. Nothing wrong with ad tech, but certainly it seems like you're focused on startups that are pursuing technologies and solutions that are actually potentially very, very beneficial to humanity.
Yeah, I think it's a win-win because, if you look at what have become the biggest companies in the world, an NVIDIA, potentially OpenAI, certainly a Tesla or SpaceX, the startups that get really big, and I would include Google in that, Amazon in that, they tend to address these kinds of problems. And so why not go for that? That's, if you execute well, then you're going to beat all the ad tech guys.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess also when you have an inspiring vision, you're able to attract talent, because at some point, no one is super motivated by working on ad tech. Very few people are.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when you have a compelling vision, then, it's sort of like you look at the people that, build rockets in, 50-degree Celsius heat in Boca Chica, Texas. The reason they do that is because they actually believe they're changing the world, and they're probably right. And so fundamentally what we want is, several of these companies here that have that are working on something that's on that level and who understand how to also communicate that such that they can attract that talent.
Yeah.
And we have some, Aura could be $100 billion Google of health, to help us live longer. We've seen what happened with GLP-1s in Denmark with Novo Nordisk and Ozempic. That is potentially one of the most game-changing tech innovations of the century, in the sense of, if you think about the kind of lifespan improvement that is having on millions of people now. Should we be putting more effort into RNA medicine, for instance? I think we should. So it's about recognizing these opportunities, and then sometimes we what we need is like a DARPA type instrument here, or maybe a Temasek. We have TESI, but it's a shadow of what it could be, in the sense that it could channel strategic funding in Finland towards this certain initiatives that I just looked up. DARPA's funding railroads on the moon, for example, with like serious money. Yeah, that's one of the strategic directions DARPA has chosen to begin investing in. And there's reasons for that. It's strategic for the United States. And so if we have that kind of visionary thinking here, and we have some of that at VTT, actually, the government national labs here, which are the origin of several of the hard science innovations that have the most promise in Finland right now, including steady energy, the small nuclear reactors for district heating company that I'm on the board of and an investor in. That project very much started at VTT and is now being run by Tommy Newman, who used to lead the nuclear power research division at VTT. And so I think that's a great example. Onego Bio is another one. There's, there are several of these that have come out of VTT, but VTT is still fairly small. We need to fund it more. We need to create, other instruments that are like that.
Yeah, capital is definitely a big piece. I want to quickly kind of talk about here at the end the other piece, which is the talent piece. And you mentioned NVIDIA, Tesla, SpaceX. These companies, what they have in common is first-generation immigrants, founded by first-generation immigrants. I think if you remove companies those companies from like the U.S. NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange, like huge portion of the equity value evaporates. So how do you think about that piece? Do we have enough? How do we attract more? Finland is a country that's way up north, difficult language, no sunlight. Like, how do you think about the talent piece? If there's the capital piece, you made a case that we could actually solve it by doing very concrete things. What do you think about talent?
Same thing. I mean, we just have to decide that we stop blocking people from coming here, particularly stop blocking the investors and the entrepreneurs. Any reasonable European country, for example, has an investor visa. Even a place like France, Finland does not. It's still impossible, frankly, to come here unless you already have an employer here. So you come work at a job, but entrepreneurs and investors generally, they don't come to work for someone else. So we have a blind spot for the most valuable people who we need the most, because they're the ones that create the companies that then create the jobs. And that's a shame. And so we need to fix that. It's just, these are just not, there's nothing very hard about this. It's super easy. It's just about whether or not you want to do it or not. And I think that, the funny thing in Finland is that the consensus is, yes, we should do these things. Everyone from the true Finns to the, leftist parties seem to all agree about these things roughly, that we need to attract more people in principle. Then you just kind of have to say, okay, well, if we really mean this, then let's do it. But that's, I think, where, unfortunately, right now we're stuck, is that there isn't a lot of action. So it's not complicated. And ultimately, we either do it or we die. I mean, there isn't really an option. It must be done. It's like Elon Musk says, it must be done. So Finland, we have no population growth, we have no productivity growth, so it's got to come from somewhere. Yeah, I think that there's unfortunate confusion that immigration somehow means something negative. In fact, it's the best thing that could happen. And the other confusion is that it necessarily means, somehow like people who we don't want. And again, you're like, well, what if you actually went out and did what Portugal or Estonia or France, or pretty much frankly now any reasonable country is doing, which is attracting and inviting the people you think you need the most, which is, by the way, what we're not doing at all. Each of these countries, France love French tech. It's even called French tech, not something in French. It's like in English. And it's an organization with, a permanent team in Silicon Valley, for instance, only focused on attracting the top Silicon Valley talent to France, arranging fast visas and hosting dinners and just generally inviting people to spend at least a part of the year living in France, because they know how big of an impact that can have on the French economy. And so, that's the other thing I think we need to understand, is that people who think like this tend to have multiple homes. They're not going to necessarily move to Finland full time because they spend a part of the year in Aspen, and they also have a house in Hawaii. And you know what? That's great. Maybe they only spend the summers here. I don't care, as long as they spend some time here and they end up funding our companies and sitting on their boards and bringing their networks and their expertise to help our businesses grow faster and employ more people, and ultimately, generate more tax euros for, the Finnish pensioners. So that's what we want. And so it's, again, just a slight expansion of the definition of immigrant. And it can make, it can work wonders. We don't need a lot of them, a couple hundred, and I bet you we'll have, triple the amount of unicorns that come out of here.
I think you made a great case that there's just been this like blind spot, probably based on just history, having Finland being, and we've only had these like big industrial companies, and we haven't really thought about startups and investors. Certainly not from a legal point of view, but you're of the opinion that Finland can actually compete with Singapore, Dubai, France, with all of its benefits, and we can compete on a global level for talent.
Yeah, I think
and
that
capital.
As climate change progresses, I was just watching videos on my way here from Dubai right now, which got deluged by a huge flood. These are all climate change related severe weather issues that are turning these places uninhabitable. What's going to happen to Singapore, tiny island, as the hurricanes in that part of the world and, other bad shit that's happening with climate change starts battering them for real. Finland starts looking like a more attractive place the further, this crisis progresses. And so in that sense, I think we're fortunate to have at least this one enormous advantage that as time moves on, Finland's simply just going to begin looking better and better.
What do you think about, I think there was, I don't know if it was like matter of being discussed, but someone proposed the idea of adding English as a national language in Finland to make it easier. What do you think about things like that, concrete?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. All it really means is that you can expect to get official service in English.
Yeah.
And, it's, again, we have multiple official languages already. Is it going to mean us losing Finnish, that Finnish is going to die? Well, I can tell you if we don't do these things, it will die for sure. We already know that, right? So these are the only things we have at our disposal right now that give us at least some chance of survival. And so, yeah, I'm for it. I think it's a great idea.
Jyri, it's been really great. I could ask you tons and tons of more questions, but we have to be mindful of your time. So one final question. I think you may have alluded to this in the conversation, but is there any specific area of like technology or technological progress that you're kind of paying a particular attention to and feel very excited or optimistic about?
Yeah, I feel really excited about, like I mentioned already, RNA. We have a company called Helix Nano that's actually run by a Finn, Hannu Rajaniemi, in Silicon Valley that has made some breakthroughs in RNA vaccines and adjuvants that make it possible for us to do really mind-blowingly cool things, basically to enhance people's health and cure disease that I'm super excited by. Obviously, I track AI very closely. I have my own thesis on that, which I'm not going to go into for lack of time. But I do think that if you're young and interested right now in what is going on with the world, go west. Spend some time in the valley. Go work with Hannu Rajaniemi at Helix Nano, or go work with OpenAI and come back and start a company here. I mean, that's what I've done, and it's worked out okay for me. So why not?
That's really good advice. Jyri, for people who want to follow you, where are you most active? Twitter, LinkedIn, or X, I should say, or LinkedIn, or?
I'm at my first name, Jyri, Jyri, at X, and you can find me on LinkedIn easily too.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. And it'll be really exciting to follow all the investments that you're making and kind of pushing for the changes that you've outlined, legal, cultural, political, here in Finland, to be able to increase, like you said, the unicorn birth rate. Yes.
And join the Finnish startup community if you are a startup founder and haven't already. We look forward to having everyone there and, becoming a force for change in this country.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. You can find all episodes of The Growth Pod on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts.